himself عند الغضب, at the time of anger. In another hadith, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says that al-ghadabu, the anger, yufsidul iman, corrupts and ruins iman, in the way kama yufsidu sabiru al-asal, in the way that the aloe plant, which is a bitter plant, it ruins honey. That if you put a bit of aloe plant into it, then all of a sudden, or something from it that's derived from it, then all of a sudden the honey becomes ruined. So in the same way, a person could build something, a family, wife, children, a job. He tries year after year after year, toiling, sleeping, sacrificing, doing so much, gathering so much, but in a snap of a finger, in a few minutes, the anger could just ruin it all. And it could come down like a house of cards. وَقَالَ النَّبِيُّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, مَا غَضِبَ أَحَدٌ, that person is never angry, إِلَّا أَشْفَ عَلَى جَهَنَّمْ, except that he reaches the border of Jahannam. In another hadith, Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, a person said to him, Ya Rasulullah, أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَشَدُّ, what is the greatest, what's the worst thing? قَالَ غَضَبُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, the anger of Allah. The person said, فَمَا يُبْعِدُنِي مِنْ غَضْبِ اللَّهِ, he said, what shall take me away and keep me at a distance from the anger of Allah Almighty, the displeasure of Allah Almighty? He says, Allah taghdab, that you yourself do not become angry. In another hadith, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, a person said to Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Murni, tell me about something. Tell me about something, about an action, but keep it concise. فقال Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, La taghdab, do not become angry. فعاد عليه مرارا. He repeated this, Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he repeated this several times. Thereafter, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, after mentioning this couple of hadith, he says, he comes out with a rhetorical question, which is a common theme throughout his Ihya Ulumuddin. He says, وَكَيْفَ لَا تَعْظُمُ آفَةَ الْغَضَبِ. He says, how can you not consider great the ailment and the difficulties of anger when it has an outward and inward aspect to it? And there's an outward aspect to it. Sometimes we think that anger is for the pelwan. Anger is for the big man. Yeah? He causes violence. He rolls his sleeves up. He becomes angry and he's ready to fight. We think it's violence. Or anger is only confined to the person who swears and speaks the loudest. And Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, he says that ala darb shatam italat lisan, he lengthens his tongue, he can speak eloquently and against the other person. But this is the outward aspect of anger. But there's another aspect of anger as well. There's the batin, there's the inward. Yani the inward is, the person might not be very strong, he'll be a little bit weak, he's not the alpha male, he's not the strong man, he's slightly weak. Or he might be from the opposite gender. She might not be able to physically combat the person. But then the anger, it then morphs and evolves into something slightly different. It becomes hiqt, yani a sense of internal hatred, hasad, jealousy, idmar su, yani the harboring of ill will regarding the other person, was shamata, and then also profanity. Yani they might swear at this person, but very quietly under their breath. وَالْعَزْمَ عَلَى إِفْشَاءِ السِّرِّ, and a conviction to spread the person's secret, وَحَتْكِ السِّرِّ, and also expose the person. وَالْفَرْحْ بِالْمُصِيبَةِ الْمَغْضُوبَةِ, and to become happy when the other person goes into some sort of difficulty. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that both these aspects come from anger in itself. It's got the outward aspect, it's got the inner aspect. Both are dangerous. Hakimul Ummah, Mujaddidul Millah, Moulana Shafi'i Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions in his khutbah, he says, don't think it's just the outward burst of rage that is anger. The inward is just as disastrous. Men, he says, may be prone to express themselves physically or by speaking, but the inward is just as bad, and the opposite gender might be inclined towards harboring ill feeling inside themselves. The outward aspect of anger subsides very quickly. Some people become angry and it subsides very quickly. But the second can continue for a long time and morph into other things. Both are dangerous. There's a principle here, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he then talks about qasrul ghadb, breaking of anger, and how to suppress the provocation. But before that, something I came across in one of the writings of Imam Moulana Shafi'i Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, he says that when it comes to anger, a person goes through 3 stages. 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 is the provocation. Number 1 is the provocation. Number 2 is acting on it. And the third is that he was provoked. So first is provocation, either he acts on it, or on the other side, he does not exactly act on it, but when it subsides, he then does something while staying in conformity with Shariat and the teaching of Deen. 3 things. So Imam Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah alayhi, he says that the provocation in itself, to become angry at that time, but not to act on it, but just to become passionate, to become upset in itself, this isn't forbidden. And we can't all be soft, gentle people, that you're somewhere and somebody does something, you don't become angry. Naturally, if something happens that's not in conformity the way we want things or should be, or according to how we perceive things, then to become upset and angry, then this isn't forbidden. The Sharia doesn't command that we remain calm all the time. If this was the case, then how would Islam have spread? And if the battles that took place, if anger channeled in the right way wasn't there, then how would Islam spread? It wouldn't have spread. So anger in itself, to a certain degree, in conformance with Sharia, is completely fine. But then when you move on next, at the spur of the moment, when you're angry, what do? Do you act on it? Experience shows that acting, Imam Hazrat Hakim al-Ummat Thanvi Rahmatullah says, experience shows that acting on passion is contrary to one's intellect. There's a lot of negativities associated with this. A person might get pleasure at the time, but then he will definitely regret later. He might have sworn at someone, he attacked someone, the outcome is negative. It's also unnatural, and it's not according to Sharia. That's the part where you need to confine yourself, control yourself. You have the ikhtiyar, you have the choice. Kick it into action and stop getting angry at that time. You get angry, but don't act on the anger. And then the other way is that the person was provoked, but he didn't act on his anger. Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah says that he's provoked, but then he acts sensibly. The effect of some anger should be there. So for example, something's happened, it's not right, it's not what I wanted to happen. You could get up fisticuffs, get into a bit of a fight with the other person. It could become a larger situation. But you control yourself at that time. And then you speak to the person, maybe sternly, but within the confine of Shariat and how your mind should be, how socially we should be living with each other. You might rebuke the other person, but you don't go at them like thunder and lightning, Hazrat Thanvi says. And this is how the person should actually be. So Imam Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah says that the provocation itself is natural. We're all going to get angry at some point in time. That's something inside us. We can't suppress that. But what do we do then? Do we go this way or this way? Do we act on impulse and attack the other person, say what we want, and break all the norms? Or do we control ourselves at that point and then deal with this in a mature way? So Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah is saying the second option is better, and this is the way we should do. But how do you do this? Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah, he also discusses this. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah discusses this. What I did was I combined both together to come up with a bit of an explanation that's inshallah useful for everybody. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah says, Alayka fi sifatil ghadbi wadhifatan. He says that there's 2 things that a person should do when he becomes angry. Number 1, he should train himself. And number 2, he should control. The first is training, the second is controlling. So how do you control yourself? He says, breaking it by training. You do riyada, you do some sort of practice to break your anger. He says, he's very clear, he says that it doesn't mean that you completely remove anger, because that's not possible, but you suppress it. And you train it so that it remains under your control. Not that the anger is controlling you. Imam Ghazali mentions that if a person was to remove his anger completely, then he should try and reinstate it to a certain extent so that it's controlled. And he then mentions, similar to the example before, that for example the wars that took place, a bit of anger was necessary. Likewise, he then continues and he says, and he gives the example of a hunting dog. That a hunting dog, inside the Arabian lands you see them, it's trained so that when it's directed and it understands something, then and he's given the instructions, it goes and does exactly what it's told to do, and it comes back. So likewise, a person should be able to control themselves and their anger in a way that it's controlled by their intellect and also by Shariat. And he says that this is possible with mujahada, by a sheikh controlling a person and teaching him bit by bit, and it can easily happen. But it takes time, and it takes the guidance of a sheikh. So that's the training bit that he mentions. Then he goes on and he says that there's another aspect, and this is called controlling. That a person controls his anger by swallowing it when provoked. And he says there's two things to assist a person. When something provokes a person, what should he do? There's two things to assist him. Number one, there's knowledge, a type of information, something that he needs to keep in mind. And the second thing is certain actions he should do. The thing that he mentions in terms of his understanding, he needs to change his perspective. Imam Ghazali says that one should realize that actually there's no reason for me to become angry. If something happens that's contrary to how one expects things to happen, then he shouldn't really become angry. Why? Because when he becomes angry, he's actually going against the will of Allah Almighty. Because Allah Almighty ordained and deemed that thing should happen. Why should he go angry? Why should he become angry? Because becoming angry is becoming negative, or having negative thoughts towards what Allah has decreed. So if you bring that to your mind, then automatically you've turned towards Allah Almighty. You become slightly, your anger should control itself at that time. So that's the first thing that he mentions in terms of a perspective. The second thing he says is he should realize that the opportunity for Allah Most High to be angry with a person is greater than him being angry with the person underneath him. A person's child does something wrong and he becomes angry. He's going to lash out. But then he should think to himself, now wait a second, why should I lash out with my son who's disobeyed me? Whereas the opportunity for me, the occasions on which Allah Almighty, I have disobeyed Allah Almighty for everything, every bounty and favor that He's given me is so much, but Allah Almighty still favors me. And He doesn't lash out at me, He doesn't become angry with me. So when a person thinks like this, and again, slowly but surely, his perspective, his mental perspective will help him overcome his anger, inshallah. So these are the two things in terms of knowledge that a person should adopt when becoming angry. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah then mentions, and he says that in terms of actions, there's a couple of things that he can do. Number one, he says do ta'awuz. Saying ta'awuz, yani a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Yani I seek refuge in Allah from the accursed Satan. Why? Because anger in itself, it comes from Satan. It comes from shaitan. And I'll explain to you in a little while how. The second thing he mentions is changing his posture. If he's sitting down, then if he's standing up, then sit down. If he's sitting down, then lie down. Our community is slightly different. When we become angry and we sit lying down, we sit up. And if we're sitting, we stand up. If we're standing, then we jump up. And if somebody comes in between, then the drama kicks in even more. It's like a Punch and Judy show. Yeah? You know, the guy's threatening somebody comes in front of him, or stop, he does it more. Most of the time you can't do anything. But this is what changing ta'awuz, yani saying a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and the second is changing posture. Moulana Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, he mentions this much, but Moulana Thanvi rahmatullah in his khutbah, he has a very interesting point. He says there's a reason behind this. Why should you do ta'awuz and why should you change your posture? He says when standing, then a person is at a distance from the earth. A person is, well, before that he says that a'udhu billah. Why? Because he's doing, the anger in itself is come from shaitan. So he's doing ta'awuz from shaitan. He's trying to run him off. That's the first thing. If shaitan becomes far away, then inshallah, his anger will subside. So that's the first thing for ta'awuz. But why do you change your posture? So he says when a person is standing, then a person is at a distance from the earth. But when he is sitting, he's closer to the earth. And when he is lying, then he's even closer. And the ground is naturally humble. The ground is naturally humble. And his humbleness has an effect on the person. And the humility is the opposite of pride. And pride comes with anger. When a person is pride, he becomes angry. So by bringing himself to the positive vibes, the humble vibes in the earth, the humble energies in the earth, that's what he's literally saying, a person becomes slightly humble, and then the anger subsides. Imam Hazrat Tanvi Rahmatullah says this is ilaj bizdid. He says that this is curing somebody with the opposite. And then he says when someone gets angry, and usually a person gets angry, he preps up. He's ready to kick off. You know, his posture changes. He might lean on his back leg a little bit. He stands sideways. He's ready. You know, his guards are up, etc., etc. So that's the reason why a person should change their posture. He then continues, and he says, Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi says that the other thing that a person should do, and he still doesn't get calmed down, فَلْيَتَوَضَّى, let him make wudu. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, "Inna al-ghadaba min ash-shaytan." Anger is from shaitan. Wa inna ash-shaytana khulika min an-nar, and indeed the devil has been created from fire. Wa inna ma tudfa'u an-nar bil ma', and fire is extinguished with water. Fa idha ghadiba ahadukum falyatawadda. So when a person becomes angry, then let him do wudu. Yani anger is from shaitan, and shaitan has been created from fire. So when he does wudu, the water extinguishes fire. So then his anger subsides. Again, Hazrat Tanvi Rahmatullah Alayhi, he mentions a short story here, very interesting. He says, Urwa bin Muhammad, I think he was a tabi'i, was visited by another tabi'i, Abu Wa'il. They had a conversation, and Urwa became angry over something. Immediately he asks for water. He asks for water, and he performs wudu, and he offers 2 rakat, and he says, after that my father heard the Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam say that anger is from shaitan. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that shaitan has been created from fire. See how at the time of anger, the effects of heat appear inside the person. His face becomes red. His hands and face begin to shake. His veins start popping out. This is all because of fire. Hazrat Tanvi Rahmatullah mentions that in a hadith, it says, Shaitan was once asked, where do you live? He says, when a man is happy, then in the heart. But when he becomes angry, then on top of his head. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was the perfect Hakim, as the Tanvi says. He was the perfect wise person. Anger is from shaitan. And then he explains that a person should do wudu just to combat not just the heat through water and its cooling effect, but also the effect of shaitan in himself. Yani his shaitan is based on kufr. And by performing wudu, a person is also doing an act of ibadat, because wudu itself is ibadat. So not only is he extinguishing the fire, he's also at the same time pushing kufr away, pushing shaitan away by doing an act of obedience. The last thing that he mentions is placing his face on the ground. At this point, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, he stops there and he gives these few advices that when a person becomes angry, let him do ta'awuz, and he pray a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Second thing is change his posture and do wudu, and also place his face on the ground. Imam Hazrat Tanvi Rahmatullah Alayhi, he mentions a few other things. He says that let a person at that time when he becomes angry move away from the place. Go somewhere else. Calm down and then come back. And he said, he also advises that person who often becomes angry, then let him write on a piece of paper, Allah has more power over you than you have over them. Allah has more power over you than you have over them. And this is because people become angry and then act on the angry when the other person is perceived to be weak. If the other side seems tough, then they won't get angry. There's a story that he then mentions about an elephant. He went mad. And he began roving around and they're trying to control it. Big elephant, I don't know how much it weighs. They couldn't control it. In the end, they decided that they need to shoot this elephant. So they all decided, like, we'll shoot this elephant, we'll kill the elephant, because there's no other way. It's just going around, it's roaming through the village, breaking everything down. But the owner, he went to an old, seasoned handler, an elephant handler, an elephant trainer, and he mentioned this entire episode. He said, the issue is very simple. Get a cardboard cutout of a lion and place that at a distance from the elephant. Let's see what it does. So that's what they did. They brought this cardboard cutout paper tiger. Yeah, paper tiger. They brought this cardboard of a cut-out cardboard lion and they placed it at a distance. Immediately, the elephant calmed down. So that's the way our angry people sometimes are. That it depends on who's on the other side. I mean, I don't see it now very much, but about 20 years ago, you know, when you're driving on the motorway, over the bridges, they'd have a cardboard cutout police car, yeah, in case people are speeding. That used to happen. Everyone slows down because they think there's a police car there. Likewise, the cardboard cutout lion. So Hazrat Tanvi Rahmatullah, he mentions the same. And he says that the presence of mind regarding Allah will prevent him. The other thing that he mentions is that person you're getting angry with, perceive and think about it a little while. That today I have strength over him, but tomorrow maybe he's got strength over me. And then Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah alayhi, he ends with a couple of hadiths. He said, Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Inna rajula yudriku bil hilmi darajat al-qa'im as-saim. That the person, through forbearance, yani being tolerant and not getting angry, he can reach the level of a person who performs prayer at night and he fasts during the day. And that is written for him, that he is of overwhelming might, as long as, even though the only thing he has under his control is his family. And this is the fadilat and the virtues of a person who stands up, who actually controls his anger. Another hadith, Nabi Karim Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says, Man kadama ghaydan walau sha'a an yamdiyahu amdahu malahu Allah ta'ala qalbu yawm al-qiyamati amanan wa iman. That the person who drinks and swallows his anger, when he is in a position to fulfill everything that his anger is asking him to do, that Allah Almighty shall fill his heart on the day of judgment with peace and iman. Nabi Karim Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said in another hadith, Ma min jur'atin, there is no gulp or swallow, ahabba ilallah, more beloved to Allah Almighty, min jur'ati ghaydin, than the swallowing of anger that a person swallows and suppresses. وَمَا كَظَمَهَا عَبْدٌ إِلَّا مَلَى اللَّهُ تَعَالَى قَلْبُهُ إِيمَانًا. And the person who swallows his anger, Allah Almighty fills his heart with iman. As the Tanvi Rahmatullah alayhi mentions a story at this point. He says that Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he had some guests who came into his house. So he asked his slave to go and prepare some food. He came, he put the dastakhan down. Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu sits down with his guests, and the person comes from the kitchen with a pot of shorba, curry, and he spills it. And he spills this straight hot curry onto the face of Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu naturally becomes, he becomes upset, and he gives a stern look to the slave. Immediately the slave turns around and he reads the verse of the Quran Kareem, وَالْكَاذِمِينَ الْغَيْظِ, those who swallow their anger. Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala, immediately he says, قَضَمْتُ غَيْظِ, that I have swallowed my anger. Then he says, وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ, the next bit of the ayat, those who forgive the people. So Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala immediately says, عَفَوْتُ عَنْكَ, that I have forgiven you. Then he says, وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, Allah Almighty loves the good doers. And immediately he says, I freed you for the sake of Allah Almighty. This was our Akabir. Imam Shah Ismaeel Shaheed Rahmatullah alayhi says about him that he was given a bayan, and as he was given a bayan, a mukhalif came and he sat and he said, I have a question to ask you. He said, ask your question. He says, I heard that you are the child, that you are an illegitimate child. And your mother and father were not born. He says this in a bayan. Shah Ismaeel Shaheed Rahmatullah alayhi wasn't any old individual. He was a person who commanded an army. He was a person who took out battalions to challenge some of the oppression that was taking place in the Punjab in the early 19th century. Shah Ismaeel Shaheed Rahmatullah alayhi was a military man. Immediately, people in the crowd, they could have easily taken retribution. So Shah Ismaeel Shaheed Rahmatullah alayhi remained calm, and he said that, in such a place and such a place, there are still people today present who witness the marriage and the nikah of my mother and father. If you wish, you can go there and ask them, but I'm definitely not of that progeny. And he swallowed his anger like this. Afterwards, the person came and he did tawbah at his hands. And he showed softness and gentleness. And it's a lesson for me as well, because I probably suffer from more anger than anybody else. Imam Abu Hanifa Rahmatullah alayhi, he was teaching once, and a person came and he asked him the question. He says, oh, I believe that your mother is a widow now. That's right. He's asking about his mother in a crowd where he's teaching. I heard she's very beautiful. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi says, stayed quiet. He said, why don't you marry her to me? This person then asks. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah. Imam A'adham, one of the four Imams. Imam Sahib rahmatullah alayhi, he says, she's an adult. I have to take her permission. Let me go and ask her first. Let me go and ask her first. He got up and he began walking home. But then he turned his back, and he turned around and he looked, and this person had passed away. This person had passed away. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi says that, he said then that my patience killed him. Yani sabri qatalahu, my patience killed him. But this was Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi. This was his stature. And this is the way our Akabir actually dealt with anger. So if there's anything to take away from this, very quickly, in summary, there's three aspects of anger. Number one is the actual provocation. A person can't deal with that. If you're provoked, you're provoked. But then what do? Do you act on impulse, or do you go the other way? And you take your time, and you bring your anger under the control of Shariat and your intellect. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when a person becomes angry, what should he do? Change position, move away. If you're standing, sit down, lying. Put your head on the ground to the closest place that's as humble as possible. Do wudu and also do ta'awuz, and involve yourself in ibadat and get that shaitan away. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.